Hey everyone, welcome to the weekly digital brainstorm presented by the Microsoft Advertising Brand Studio. I'm Geoffrey Cologne, head of Brand Studio, joined with my colleague Aya Kikimova, who's back in New York City. Aya, how you doing?
Hey, doing good. So far, so good. Can't complain. Back in my home in New York
I
City.
can,
How are you?
I'm good. I can tell because I heard a bus sort of drive by for a second. So that's actually good. It's better to have lively sounds than just silence after all these weeks.
Absolutely, yeah. So apologies for any background noise.
No, it makes it cool and dynamic. So, hey, let's update everybody who's maybe new to the brainstorm. What did we talk about last week?
Yeah, last week we talked about shopping from home and we identified the top three trends. Extremely online, where we talked about how everything is going online. People are shopping online. If you're not online, you're not selling. Number two was your house is your home base. Everybody's doing everything from home, working out, cooking, eating, hanging out. So that's another trend and the impact of that on some brands and some industries. And we also talked about the DIY prosumer, meaning that now that people are at home and they have, services are not available, they're starting to figure out how to do things on their own and search queries like how to make these types of things and how to do this are on the rise, like 900% in some cases.
It's awesome. And we'll make sure we drop a link if you want to watch last week's episode. We'll also drop a link to the blog post from last week if people want to read that just based on some of the insights we have. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. And of course, if you're watching us on LinkedIn or YouTube, let us know if you have questions. This week, we
Yeah.
unleashed a post this past week on everyone is part of Generation D. What does that mean? What is Generation D?
Well, D stands for differences. No, I'm just kidding. D stands for devices. But before that, Jeff, why don't you kind of maybe give us an agenda of sorts? What are the top three things? And I know you wrote the post, so maybe it would be beneficial for us to kind of get the download of what to expect today.
Yeah, of course. It's always good. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the demographic differences that we're seeing out there, how people in different generations are responding to COVID-19 and maybe some of the new behaviors that they're taking on. That's the first area we'll dive into. But then instead of staying fixated on differences, we're actually going to talk a little bit about a unifier or something that's uniting all of us. So it doesn't matter what age group you're in. We're all part of Generation D now, which is generation devices. We're seeing a lot of behaviors that are similar no matter what demographic you're in, which is making us more into, like, I guess, a unified culture in some of these areas, a monoculture, so to speak. And then we'll dive into a third section, which is just how this is affecting a few verticals, things like retail, which we spoke about last week, financial services, advertising, which we're all in. And then we'll basically just take it from there, since we love these to be, short, sweet, and full of information and insight.
Yeah, love it. So, speaking of generational differences, should we first define what generations we're talking about?
Yeah, so we looked at four, and again, we just looked at four that are mainly in the in the workplace, that make up a majority of consumer activity. Obviously, Generation Z, the millennial generation, Generation X, and the boomer generation. Those were just information that we were able to get our hands around and look at some of the research. What we basically saw was that for Generation Z, and again, you can read the entire blog post, but we'll pull out a couple of nuggets here. They're recognizing COVID-19 now as probably the most impactful event in their life at the moment, similar to the silent generation and how they approached the Great Depression. This, I think, I'd love your point of view on this. This will have a lasting impression on this generation based on the fact it's, taking up a majority of their time. Many of that generation might be, or I should say, are in of college age right now. They may be in college. That might be hindering some of their plans. They might be new to the workforce. That's hindering some of their plans. They may be in high school, or like my two daughters in elementary school. And that's changing how they look at the world in terms of, things like socialization, education, how they're learning. What are some of your, insights you might have or feedback on Gen Z?
I do agree. I think this is, the only big event they have experienced so far. They just haven't lived long enough to experience all the previous crazy crises that we've had. So I think a lot of the Gen Z is graduating now. So this is definitely a weird situation to experience those kids, graduating high school, graduating college, like you said, and entering the workplace in crisis. So this definitely has a huge impact on them, and they recognize that. However, as a millennial myself, I know that what you wrote there is super on point, that we have experienced now 4 major crises.
Yep.
From the dot-com collapse to 9/11, 2008 recession, and now COVID-19. So as a result, I guess we are a little bit more robust in a way, kind of have built out that resilience. And as you mentioned here, we're the generation that doesn't own but rents. Doesn't apply to me, but in most cases, I did notice, I'm part of this group on Facebook where people kind of exchange homes, and they don't even own them and they rent them. So they travel nomadically around.
Yep.
So and a lot of them are millennials. What about your point of view on the Gen Z, the Generation X?
Yeah,
right?
Gen X. So if we looked at some research there, and we saw that, again, we're sort of the sandwich generation. So we're dealing with maybe kids of our own, and then also our parents, and how we approach that maybe a little bit different. We may have parents who don't think this is as big of a deal, so we're sort of navigating that. And then we have kids that it may be a big deal, but it may be a big deal based on things that when you put it into context, they might be saying like, oh, this is terrible. I can't, see my friends. I can't really have physical contact with other people. I can't participate in activities. So it changes their viewpoint of the world, where they're, maybe becoming more of the electronic generation by default. So there's, we're sort of navigating from the middle. And again, if you think about it, Generation X has always been the middle child. It's always been the Jan, to use a Brady Bunch reference, when it comes to demographics.
Do you think, from your opinion, you having to deal with parents who may be impacted by COVID, or know of any other Gen X folks who, have hardships with parents dealing with COVID? Also, you have to kind of parent and deal with online education with your kids.
Yeah.
Do you feel like because you are in that sandwich situation, you have like a double whammy compared to the rest of us who don't have kids yet, as millennials and Gen Z?
Yeah, I mean, again, the research we have, it doesn't, it's not necessarily applicable to everyone's scenario. But if you are in a situation where you're dealing with kids and parents, yeah, there's I feel like there is a lot of stress there in terms of how do you handle it all? Is your message getting through to everyone in terms of how to handle new behaviors? I know in talking to my parents and my my in-laws, there's always questions on, hey, where are you getting your information from? maybe you should look at this and read this, or have you adopted this type of technology that will make your life maybe a little bit more convenient during this time period. So there's a lot of behavior adaptation, for lack of a better term, that we're having to maybe act as curators on, or sort of educators on. I guess the big, joke in my house is I feel like, I'm an IT person, because I'm, responsible for all the, is everybody online? Can everyone do this? Have you done your homework? Have you, gone out and done some exercise? There's a lot of things that I think we have to handle. So, again, this scenario very different from, the typical work from home, attitudes that I think a lot of people might be passing out there in a lot of their think pieces.
Yeah, definitely. What surprises me is that boomer generation is, from our research, moving on to the baby boomers, they are kind of like the least concerned about the virus. Is that true?
That's what we've seen. Yeah, I think and again, I think a lot of this plays in experiences. If you've been through a lot, or you've seen a lot in your life, you may just say, hey, this isn't, not that it's not a big deal, but you might just be like, hey, this is how I'm going to approach this. Which might be different from if this is something that's new to you. So that's a lot of that we've seen, and I think the other thing too is the role that information plays. If you're getting certain information from specific sources, that might cause behavior, your behavior to not really change as much as maybe we expect it to.
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, and the research does show that wherever your sources are, probably location as well,
yep,
does impact these sorts of choices. Cool. Well, these seem like really substantial differences across generations. Different worries and different sort of impact from COVID-19. How about you? You mentioned that there's devices, Generation D, as you coined it. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So let's look at, a lot of research has a tendency of staying fixated on the differences we have as people, the differences we have in terms of our demographics. What we're seeing now is that there is a unifying factor, regardless of what age group you might be in. There is the fact that we are now all part of this Generation D, or generation devices. And what we're seeing is that there is just adoption of doing a number of things, regardless of generation, on how people maybe are passing their time, and maybe taking up a new hobby, maybe learning something new, maybe applying something to the work that they do, maybe applying something to finding a new job. I mean, again, depends on the situation that you're in, but based on our research, we a decent amount, 48%, are pretty much watching online video. This isn't really something that we should say, hey, that's brand new, but it's interesting to see it across all four generations, that this is an area that a lot of people are spending time on. That, and 40% are watching streaming TV. Again, not necessarily a groundbreaking, insight here, Aya, but important in the sense that there's a tendency, I think, of a lot of marketers and advertisers to say, yeah, I may not do those things, or I may do those things, but nobody else is doing those things. It's interesting to see the research, behind the behaviors there. I think the most interesting nugget is we've heard for many years people saying, TV is not relevant, or it's dead. And yet we have 44% of people watching broadcast TV across different generations. I think this is also fascinating because, again, based on context, you might, you're not moving around as much. You're at home, you're in your apartment. So this might be an area that you're getting your local news from, or you're just getting some information from, or you're sort of just passing the time watching, interesting programming. And then streaming music, 32% of people across generations are doing this. And I think a lot of this also is the if we look at one other nugget, the adoption of smart speakers has been very big in both Generation X and the Boomer generation. And I think that's where they stream music now, even if it's streaming radio, I should say local radio through those devices. That's, a pretty significant number. We know Gen Z and millennials probably are using, a variety of different services, whether it's Spotify or another platform like Pandora. But interesting to see that all of these are unifying us, that there's a sort of a similar behaviors here that, for our audiences, the marketers, advertisers, and business planners of the world, I think this is really, relevant information, because for the last decade, I think we had a hard time figuring out, like, where do we plan? Where do we put our, media money toward, where are people basically spending a majority of their time? I thought this was sort of fascinating, how we're becoming unified in a lot of these areas.
And do you think this trend will stick around? I know a lot of the states are reopening in a lot of part of the world. So will that have an impact on these trends, do you think, in media consumption?
I think it'll be interesting. I think the other thing to look at is, does this stick 1 year from now based on the context of change? I mean, I think the interesting thing here is if we look at 40% of people watching streaming TV, where do they take that with them as maybe they move around? That'll be interesting, especially with this Generation D that we're all a part of. It's pretty easy to watch Netflix from your couch, but it's also easy to watch it from, anywhere else that you might be, because of the nature of how this technology works. So I think these are things that, probably will stick for the long run, just because, as a lot of neuroscientists have said, you need 66 days to build a habit. We definitely are in that situation in a lot of areas. And I think this is the tipping point.
Oh yeah, it's definitely been more than 66 days, I think. So we'll probably form some habits. And speaking of some habits and trends in various industries, do you want to move to that section, just kind of talking about those? Yeah.
Yeah, I think another important thing for, any of our viewers, if, there's some areas that we looked at in terms of, different industries, from advertising to healthcare to financial services to retail. If you want a deeper dive on it, I, definitely would check out our insights. We update them regularly. They're at microsoftadvertising.com/COVID. We'll put a link in the section so people can check those out. But I think 3 areas to call out, Aya, in the area of advertising, which, you and I work in. What we're starting to see is that what many companies have used this period for is actually long-term planning and short-term planning. So instead of panicking, they maybe have thought, hey, what do we do over the next 3 months? And then what do we do over like the next year? And I think that's been interesting, is the advertisers who are planning and not panicking so much may end up, doing okay on the other side, so to speak, if we use that language, with, with where they go. And I think they're probably using a lot of this planning time to figure out where our audience is. How do we reshape some of our media budgets and use them in a way that's, both creative as well as, performance oriented. So I think that's one call out that I want to bring to attention. What's your takeaway on that? Since, you and I work in this industry, got to ask you that.
I love that question. I mean, planning, I think, is very important. And I've seen my share of advertisers that are panicking and advertisers that are planning. And you're totally right. Like the ones that are panicking, pulling out budgets and kind of shutting down the entire operations and advertising, they are missing out, frankly speaking, because what we're seeing on our platform is that there's an increase in demand. People are not able to shop in person physically, so they are turning online to shop. So we're seeing trends with accelerated growth in some areas, notably speaking, home and garden, and we have some of those trends in the previous post where people are shopping from home. However, we are also noticing that because some advertisers are pulling out, the marketplace is becoming more efficient. So it's cheaper, cost per click basis, it's auction based. So when there's less participants in the auction, it's becoming more efficient. And therefore, people who are planning, or advertisers who are planning, participating, they're winning big time. They're winning with growth in their sales online, but also they're winning to getting those sales cheaper at higher ROI. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, no, it's a good take. I mean, I think it's an important one for us to continue to pay attention to. There's two other call outs I want to make sure that we share here. And again, we have a ton of vertical insights on our website, but in retail, and we talked a lot about this last week, and I encourage everyone to go back and check out the blog post that you wrote about it. What we're really seeing here is really less about new behaviors, Aya, and more of just about accelerated trends. And one big area of fixation or fascination really is on, the importance of supply chains. So if you're running a business where you may be going through a number of middle organizations or middle companies, how much time is that taking for the product or solution that you have to get to an end customer? That's, I think, is something that's fascinating. We've talked about this in some areas. It's almost impossible to get some types of, goods. They're just hindered by supply chain management. So I think that's an interesting, call out. And then in financial services, what we're seeing is just that there's this interconnection now of everything. And I think smarter investors have seen this forever. They've really looked more at behavioral economics than just being fixated on numerical analytics. And what we see is, financial markets, economies, public health, mental health, they're all interrelated to one another. They're all interconnected. And I think that's going to lead to a lot of interesting discussions and possible, legislation in some countries on how do we prepare maybe for the next pandemic or next big incident that could happen in the world, knowing this interconnectedness. Would love your feedback on this or the one on retail.
I love your input into the interconnectedness. To me, the financial services, another thing that's rising is the emergence of Bitcoin and new monetary solutions that potentially might unify not only just different industries across the board and creating decentralization and interconnectedness that way, but also making it global. So globalization continues to accelerate at this, at this time, even though right now and we are at home and it's country by country, state by state. It's still online spaces they don't have borders. So we are kind of in a way becoming globalized in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep going.
And supply chains, what you mentioned, I think it's important within the supply chains, the logistics part, like you touched based on that, it's a nightmare for some companies, and those companies are basically doomed to fail in current situation where they don't have a very agile supply chain system. However, if they do decide to kind of work on that, this is the perfect time and the perfect opportunity of slowdown to really focus on how to integrate their supply chains, how to make it more circular, where there's live feedback from the customer. And it all comes back to interconnectedness with the supply chain and the marketing and the customer-centric experiences of how do you get the feedback from customer at multiple touch points, and every touch point feeds the information into your entire ecosystem of the business. So you're able to optimize your supply chain, optimize your marketing, optimize your operations. So they're all kind of becoming closer and closer intertwined because we now have this fast flowing data. Data is now the ability for it to flow and to connect within different departments is important. And I know there's, some organizations are huge, and a lot of the times data doesn't flow so freely, and that misinformation can cause huge inefficiencies overall for the business.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's I think this is another topic we should, come back to and visit in the future, because it's a big one in terms of supply chain management, the interconnectedness of all these areas of the economy. I think if anything, this might be the great awakening of how we, prepare for that with our strategies in the long run moving forward.
Yeah, and another great topic would be, cash flow and how much cash companies should kind of reserve for situations like this.
That's right. There's been a lot of discussions on that too, in terms of, should companies have to put aside, 4 months of reserves so that they can operate in case there's a downturn. We read tons of articles in places like Forbes and, Money Magazine, which might say, hey, you as a person, you as an individual, Geoffrey, Aya, others, you should set aside X amount of dollars in case you have a downturn. Shouldn't that be the case for a lot of, companies, especially publicly traded companies? That'll be an interesting debate, I think, in the next, couple of months.
Yeah, I think it will be definitely kind of a debate between how much money do you go into the flow for growth, like how fast the company needs to grow and how much money does it need to do that, or do you need to slow it down in order to save it for any future downturn like this? So I'd love to discuss this topic in the future, but as of right now, I think, do you want to just summarize the three?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, let's a summary in terms of what we've talked about. So the generational differences, the differences between the 4 generations, the research that we have there, definitely take a look at that in the blog post in terms of things that you might be seeing and how you approach your business strategy from that. Then the unifying factors, what are the similarities we're seeing across generations? Again, a lot of times as strategists, business planners, media planners, we have a tendency of saying, hey, we want to reach this audience, and then we don't see the similarities between, wait, we could actually reach this audience and this audience at the same time because they're partaking in similar activities here. And then, of course, a call out to the vertical differences, or I should say the vertical trends we're seeing in areas like retail, FinServe, health, advertising. Again, if you want to go deeper on that, microsoftadvertising.com/COVID. We'll drop a link in the chat section here. And Aya, thanks again for another great digital brainstorm. Looking forward to next week and what topic we might be talking about then. I don't think we have a topic in mind, but the blog post is coming from you that for next week. So looking forward to seeing what that's about.
Sounds good.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again for everyone for joining. I'm Geoffrey Cologne from the Microsoft Advertising Brand Studio.
And I'm Aya Kikimova, Brand Studio in New York City.
All right. We'll see everybody next Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern time for our digital brainstorm. Thanks again.
Thank you, guys.